muted throughout the webinar. This will help to minimize any background noises and ensure that everyone can hear our speakers clearly. If you have any questions, you'll have the chance to ask questions by typing them into the chat box throughout the session at the presentation. We highly encourage active participation from our audience, so don't be shy and leave your questions in the chat box. Thirdly, attendance will only be shared via QR code at the end of the session, together with the feedback forms. So do stay with us until the end of the session to be able to scan the QR code. Before we start, a little introduction on PCSS. PCSS is a premier project management solutions provider focusing on enhancing organizational profits through the implementation of industry-leading practices. With expertise ranging from project management offices, software training, integration planning, project control, and team management, we want to ensure that all our clients achieve sustained success in project delivery. Backed by over 35 years of collective experience in project controls, we offer specialized solutions that elevate capabilities and maintain a competitive advantage. As a one-stop shop, PCSS is committed to meeting diverse project management needs. Moreover, we specialize in digital construction, covering 3D, 4D, and 5D BIM, optimization of tools such as drones, AR, and VR, to name a few. This emphasizes our dedication to staying technologically advanced and providing innovative solutions for the digital transformation of the construction industry in the region. Our services are also backed with the accreditation from the following bodies such as PMI, SMA, APTT, CIDB, IEM, and many more letters of the alphabet. With that said, I believe we're all set for an informative and engaging session. If you haven't already, grab your notepads and get ready to absorb valuable insights on our topics today. Now, on to our main event. It's with great pleasure that I introduce our distinguished speaker for today. Please join me in welcoming Tony Andelis, the current Senior Executive BIM Manager of Surbana Jurong. He's a graduate of Bicol University, studied in both University of Philippines and the National University of Singapore. He's currently taking postgraduate studies in transportation engineering at Mapua University. He's a registered civil engineer in the Philippines, a registered foreign professional engineer here in Malaysia, and a qualified digital delivery manager in Singapore. His professional focus is transport engineering, having previously worked for the Kuala Lumpur Singapore High-Speed Rail and Changi Airport Terminals 3 and 5. He's also registered ASEAN engineer and a chartered professional engineer, PICE structural engineering specialist, and CIAC construction arbitrator. He has 22 years combined experience in the government service, rail, water, and airport engineering, and he's worked for Jacobs, AECOM, Building and Construction Authority, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and CPG, respectively. So today's session will be discussing the evolution of BIM execution plans. If you're not already aware, BEP is a cornerstone of a successful BIM implementation, from small bungalows to multidiscipline projects. The key is understanding what the client wants and what you can deliver, and what is beneficial to the other project team members who will be using the models that you contribute. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Sonny Andelis. Over to you, Sonny.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. I'm just sharing my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Can you see now?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So good afternoon to everybody. I'm in Singapore actually. So I'm currently connected with Surbana Jurong. I'm the Senior Executive BIM Manager there. And today is basically very simple. I was tasked to explain the evolution of BIM execution plan. So basically, so we already done with the introduction. I'll discuss basically the overview. What is a BIM execution plan? We'll start with that. In Singapore in particular, in the US, there is virtual design and construction. There's also an execution plan for that actually. And then more recently in the UK, in Australia, and in Singapore, we have digital delivery plans because we are changing actually from BIM managers to digital delivery managers. And then I will be discussing to you the skill sets that is needed, So if you are preparing for a BIM execution plan, a VDC, or an IDD, there's specific skill sets that is required. And the next one would be the milestones and the deliverables. I think we will touch base on that. And then the mandatory contents. There's obviously mandatory contents. There's also optional contents on a BIM execution plan. And then we will delve deeper into the best practices. This is some things that we have learned across the projects that I have done. And then on number 9 would be EIR, the Employer Information Requirements. And what is the connection to this, to the BEP? Yeah. And then we will end with BIM execution plan samples, samples from the UK, from Singapore, and in Asia in general. And then we will end with a summary to basically compile all of the learnings that we have done so far. Yeah. Okay, so let's start with the overview. If you look at this particular map, a mind map, the BIM execution plan is actually from the supplier side. What does it mean? So a supplier can be a consultant, or it can be a contractor as well. Yeah. From the client side, there is the organization information requirements. This one, you have the asset information requirement, and then there is actually the employer information requirement. So there are actually 3 specific requirements. If you're following the ISO 19650 standards, this is basically what it will tell you, that there are 3 information requirements from the organization, from the asset, and from the employer. And then you have basically your method statement, which is the BIM execution plan. You have the project information model, and then the asset information model. So these are basically deliverables. Okay. So what I'm trying to say there is that the client produced the following, right? So the organization information requirements, the asset information requirements, and then the EIR, the employer or exchange. So if you actually look at the BS 1192, it was actually called employer. The E stands for employer, but if you read from the ISO 19650, the E stands for exchange. So you have to be careful about that, but they are interchangeable actually. It means the same thing. So the consultants actually responds via creating a BIM execution plans if it's under the BIM standards, VDC execution plans if it's under VDC, or a digital delivery plan or a DDP if it's under IDD standards. And you produce, as mentioned, the project information models and the asset information models. So that's basically the overview. So what I'm trying to tell you, if you would like to get the gist of it, is the EIR simply are the tender rate specifications. And a BIM execution plan or a VDC execution plan or a digital delivery plan are just basically like method statement. It explains how are you going to deliver a particular project specifically for a client EIR. Okay. The same is true for the asset information model. The actual deliverable is actually COBE or AD4 or Asset Data Dictionary. COBE stands for Construction Operation Building Information Exchange. This is basically like a method statement. So it's a deliverable. Okay, so that's basically the simple definition of between what is an EIR and what is actually a BEP. So let's start with I have started the discussion to basically have a few definitions, right? The building information model or BIM, you have virtual design and construction, virtual design and environment. You have that and recently, if you actually read a few EIR, they will talk about digital construction or integrated digital engineering. A lot of words, a lot of buzzwords. But basically, the BEP is to demonstrate that the project stakeholders propose the approach, the capability, the capacity, and the competence to meet the EIR. That's all actually. It is assessed prior to the appointment of the project stakeholder. So even before you start the job, you have to submit your method statement. That's all actually. So let's talk about BIM, building information model. So if you submit a BIM execution plan, what is expected of you if you are, these are the skill sets. So the common one are the 3D modeling, obviously, the 4D, the 5D, the model federation, the class check, and then the authority submission. So a BIM execution plan will require a specific skill sets from the consultant, from the contractor, from the client or the developer. Okay, even the client and the developer must be able to demonstrate that they will be able to understand and use your models that you have prepared, or the beam use case that you are proposing. Yeah. So because there's no point creating something and nobody is actually using it, it would be a white elephant. In Singapore context, because I'm actually working in Singapore, there is actually a VDC framework. Okay, so I mentioned about the VDC execution plan, or the virtual design and construction execution plan. They have a specific skill set as well. So I already tabulated for you. So these are the skill sets. So if you notice, it's massively expanded. So you have federation, you have a new common data environment that's actually common in Singapore, in Malaysia, or in Hong Kong. You have ICE meetings. These are basic, or ICP meetings. These are meetings that is attended by engineers, architects, basically those people who have the capability to make decisions. Um, you have virtual design models and virtual construction models, and you have discipline information, specific discipline information requirements. You have BIM to field, you have generative BIM, or what we call as computational BIM, and you have as-built models. So if you talk about VDC, VDC is actually coming from the US, a virtual design and construction. It's much, much more expanded. The, the level of sophistication is there, actually. You are expected to do more. And so if you are a consultant, contractor, or client and developer, you can actually have this. You have to have this specific skill set. If it's actually an X there, you don't need to do that. Okay. So when we talk about IDD, I think that's common in the market now. You have digital design, digital fabrication, digital construction, and digital asset delivery. You can read that on your own time. You will have the slides. But what we're trying to do here is that IDD is actually a bit more, how to say this, complicated. Yeah. What do I mean by that? So these are the specific IDD skill sets. So if you notice, it's actually very, very different from the VDC skill set or the BIM skill sets. You have digital design, which is actually referring to the project information model. And then you will have digital fabrication, which is the consultants and the contractor needs to do. Common data environment is common now. Yeah, so that's CDE are common now. You have drones and laser scan. This is actually to have a record of what is actually built on site. You have generative BIM, you have as-built BIM, which is the asset information model. You have the standards where you can actually look whether it is a PAS or BS standards or ISO. You have robotics now. Okay, so robotics is actually quite a new thing. Even in Singapore standards, we are now starting to have that. Digital asset, which is COBE. COBE is nothing new, but these are the general IDD skill sets to have. Okay. And then I already tabulated for you if you are a consultant, contractor, or a client. So you must have this specific skill sets. So let's go back to our main topic. I need to do that introduction for you to understand what exactly is a BIM execution plan. In reality, the BIM execution plan is an old 10-year-old standard actually. This is already 2024, right? So in Singapore, we started doing that in 2010, and then it's about 14 years old already. So if you still call it a BIM execution plan, it's actually the very, very old one. So it has to have a clearly defined roles and responsibilities. You have to have strategic planning. What are you going to do across the number of years that you are doing you're doing your project, whether you are at the design stage, construction stage, or operation and maintenance. It must have key deliverables, project milestones and realistic timelines, project goals and BIM objectives, and model quality and control procedure. So these are common, these are the must-haves. So it also have PLQs. What do you mean by that? These are basically plain language questions. There's a tendency, if you are in BIM, to have a lot of acronyms. So the idea of plain language question is to ask question that is in plain language. There's no acronym or whatever. So you do, as a BIM manager or as a client or as an engineer or an architect working on a project that is has BIM component on it. It asks you what steps to take to start a BIM project. So that's a very simple, plain language question. Yeah. So if not requesting all participants to migrate to BIM, what migration strategy would help you to bring about that change? So that is a very specific question. So let's just say, the main architect and the engineers are in BIM, but how about the specialist contractors? Are they required to be on BIM as well, or they can do CAD um, as a specialist? So you focus on specific disciplines. What should be the aim of that specific single discipline? There are projects wherein you are not talking about discipline groups, discipline anymore. You are talking about discipline groups. In one of my projects, we actually group one CSA. So we have civil, structural, and architecture. Actually, the CSA, the civil, structure, and architecture, is one group. We call it a discipline group, not more. It is actually a combination of three disciplines. So, and you have projects like MEP, MEPS, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and sanitary. And you have also MICA, So for my project in Tuas, we have MICA, mechanical, electrical, instrumentation, controls, and automation. So this is what we call discipline groups. Okay, so it's no longer, specific disciplines. The next plain language question would be who is involved and what are their responsibilities? The assignments and roles and the responsibilities that define the how, the when, to what level, and what is the purpose. And then you have to ask what models are required. Okay, what range of discipline is needed if an aggregate model is to be created? Aggregate model is another term for federated. You see, when are they required? They have to be produced. Is it on a weekly basis, a fortnightly, or a monthly basis? And at what project stages are the models needed? Okay, so that is the common questions that is asked if you are creating a BIM execution plan. And what are the models to be used for? Is it for visualization? Are you extracting data? For example, are you extracting the quantities from your model? Are you going to use the models for producing PDF or drawings? Is it for simulation and analysis? Is it for quantity takeoff? So there's a lot of reason why I would create a BIM execution plan, and it has to be very, very specific. And then the last one would be how will the models be exchanged and in what format? Are we exchanging native models? Are we exchanging lightweight models? Or are we exchanging open BIM formats? You have IFC, BCF, and so on and so forth. So it's complete. It has to be clearly written in your BIM execution plan. You have there also who is managing the project, the location of the project team participants, because on some big projects, multinational, the scope of work, like for example, for the architects, they may be co-located elsewhere. They may be in the UK or in the US. Your structural team is in Spain or in Hong Kong, and then your mechanical team is actually dispersed in the Middle East. Yeah, so it depends. Yeah, if a particular company has a global design center, this can be a big problem. Yeah. So what risks are involved? So what I'm trying to say is that there's a specific need to write a BIM execution plan. Okay. These are the early adopters I mentioned about. This is basically from the US, obviously Indiana University and the Los Angeles colleges. These execution plan, if you notice, these are in 2009 and 2010. They are the first adopters of what a BIM execution plan is. So if you actually look at this early BIM execution plan, you would actually understand that there's a proposed strategy. Strategy is very, very important in utilizing BIM during the design stage. And then the second purpose of this execution plans is what is the strategy during the construction stage? Yeah. So you have obviously a design stage. This can be in terms of months or even year. In my project currently, we are designing it for the last 4 years, still designing it. We are still at the design stage. Construction stage is obviously very long. So, version of the software and then the file formats are changing. You may have started in Revit 2020, but now it's 2024. Are you using still version 2020 or are you using version 2024? So what is your strategy? What is your soft landings? So these are the things, these are the questions that you need to answer. I mentioned about the software to be used, the file formats, the exchange protocol. We will discuss that in detail later, and the project team qualifications. And then, is it specific? So this particular questions is US specific. So they're talking about virtual design and construction manager. In the US, there's a difference between virtual design manager and virtual construction manager. So there's a big difference with the VDC workflow as compared to the Asian BIM execution plan. So this is basically the what the early adopters are talking about. Yeah. The next one to discuss is roles and responsibilities. This is a sample of our roles and responsibilities. This is normally done on a table or an Excel spreadsheet. If you actually go to the early adapters in 2009 and 2010, you would actually see this. We are still doing this actually, even if you have a VDC or an IDD project. We are still producing roles and responsibilities because it is actually necessary to see who is doing who and who is supposed to create and generate what kind of documents or models for a specific project. You have milestones as well and deliverables. If you notice there's a conceptualization stage, schematic stage, design development, all the way to construction document. So even if you notice, even in 2009 and in 2010, this is the early, you have, for example, at DD stage or design development stage, you have architectural model, you have your energy model, structural models, you have your cost estimate, a collision report, a discipline collision report. There's even COBE, because COBE is actually in the US, is quite popular in the US since 2010. So COBE is basically a data exchange format between the modeling stage and the facility management stage. So that is quite important especially if you are doing government buildings in the US. Yeah. So these are the deliverables if you are actually creating a BIM execution plan in the early 2010s. So I mentioned about mandatory contents, right? So when you talk about BIM execution plan, the mandatory contents, there are only 5. Number 1, you have a project initiation and description. You have to have a modeling plan. You have to have an analysis plan. Actually, a lot of people are actually deleting the analysis plan. They're just jumping to collaboration. But analysis is actually quite interesting. The engineers, the architects must be using the models for analysis. There's a collaboration plan and a quality control plan. So these are the mandatory components if you are implementing a BIM execution plan. What do you mean by that? So how about project information? So the owner, the project name, the location and address, and the description. Okay. So, and then as part of that, you have the goals actually discuss about the review, the decision support, the analysis, coordination, and class detection, and your QA/QC. So these are the modeling goals. What are you going to use the model for? So this is the first important component if you are creating a BIM execution plan. The project goals, if you actually go by this, so you have, these are the common ones, is to have a fully coordinated and assembled model. You have separate models in the original authoring software. You have project data, whether it is schedules or drawing or facility management data under COBE, and your 2D deliverables, whether it is a proprietary format like DWG or DGN, or it is neutral like PDF. Yeah, so these are considered lightweight files. And then you need to have the project uses of your BIM at the plan, design, construct, and the operation stage. These are typical ones. As mentioned to you, this is the project goals even before if you are creating BIM execution plans at the early 2010s. So these are, you have your existing conditions modeling. Now there is a lot of emphasis on laser scanning and point clouds. So before, the existing conditions modeling are done actually manually. Yeah, but now you have laser scanner to import, point clouds there. And then you have your analysis, whether it's a structural, lighting, mechanical, and other. This is LEED. In Singapore context, we have green mark. I don't know about Malaysia. And then we have code validation. if you have heard, in Singapore, we are transitioning to model-based code checking. So we are reviewing models without people there. They're actually reviewed by computer programs. And then you go all the way to record models, which is the as-built models, and so on and so forth. So, what I'm trying to emphasize here, for example, in the operation stage, is that if you are creating models specifically to be given to the client or the developer or whoever will be managing the project, it is very important to focus on asset management. What information do you need to embed inside the model to be given to the operations and maintenance personnel? That is actually quite a interesting part, because this usually becomes an afterthought. So you have done your design models, you have done your construction models, but your FM models are actually just an afterthought. It must not be like that, you know. The correct way is that you have a form of data drop, meaning to say that if you have 100 parameters or attributes, the design will take 30, for example, the construction will take 50, and then the rest, maybe like 35 or 40, will be actually will be inputted or put in by the management people. So that is actually very important to understand. So it must be a primary BIM use case and not as a secondary or an afterthought. So I hope you understand that. Project goals. So I mentioned you have to, one of the BIM execution plan project goals is to identify the value and risk for each of the BIM uses, whether it is high, medium, or low. You identify the responsible parties, the rate, the capabilities of each party. This is important in terms of resources, competency, and experience. Yeah. So in our projects, when we review BIM execution plan, we actually grade them depending on their competency and experience, because a lot of projects are not similar. So every project is different. So you have to grade, put up assess their capability in terms of this for each BIM use, rate their capabilities for each particular BIM use. Okay. In terms of project team, so in a particular project, whether it's a small project or a big project, you always have BIM managers, or in the current context, you have digital delivery managers. You also have coordinators between disciplines, and you also have modelers. So it's important to actually put in the responsibilities of each of them. Yeah. So they will not be they have distinct responsibilities, and then not allowing them to actually the responsibilities to actually overlap. Yeah. So this is actually important to avoid issues during design and construction. Yeah. So this is quite important. Roles and responsibilities in BIM execution plans. I mentioned about putting in the roles and responsibilities specifically. So this is a typical example of that. Of project BIM objective. This is the objectives, and then who will be responsible for it. Is it the architect, the structural engineer, the mechanical engineer, the QS, the contractor, the facility manager, or others, or specifically the specialist? You know, who will be the model author, and who will be the user. So this is actually quite common. Yeah. And then you have process maps. You know, this is actually quite old. I cannot give to you the actual one that I'm using for my projects. So you have specific models. What are they going to be? How are they going to be federated? And who will be actually doing the quality assurance and quality control? So these are specifically process maps that that is required in a BIM execution plan. This is just a continuation. So this is the left side. This is under design, and then during construction, it's much more complicated because you need to provide models that is coming from subcontractors and then federating it or consolidating it. Consolidated model is the same as federation models. How do you going to federate that in submission to the client, in submission to the for submission to the authority, and then for submission to the engineers and the architects. So you have to be very specific on how are you going to federate or combine your models. This is another example of a process map, quite old already, but this is the initial stages of BIM execution plan in the early 2010s. Yeah. If the another important feature of a BIM execution plan is your modeling plan. So for example, the architect, the civil engineer, the structural engineer, the mechanical engineer, what exactly are they going to do? And then what particular authoring software are they going to use? Yeah, so that is important. In Singapore context, this is actually published in 2010. This is actually quite old. At the time, we require site models and then architectural elements from the architectural models. The structural elements will obviously have the uh, load-bearing elements like foundation, beam, columns, and so on. Civil at the time, at the early stages of the BIM execution plan in the early 2010 to 2015, you have digital terrain models. Okay, that is actually required to actually see the existing condition. You have geology reports. Even at the time, we were actually doing AGS already, AGS format. You can import that into Sequent or in GINT or Civil 3D. You have utilities model before. Rain and stormwater. This is actually specific for infrastructure projects. You have underground public utilities and others, you see. So this is quite common already in the early 2010s. Yeah. So most of the BIM execution plan. So if you notice, there's a distinct difference between a building project and an infrastructure project. So if you have a building project, you would have the typical architectural and structural and the mechanical beam elements. And if you have an infrastructure project, you will have a lot more of the civil beam elements. Yeah, that is not quite common, but for infrastructure projects, that is actually very necessary to have. You know, and you must have the capability to actually model them in 3D. Yeah. Okay, analysis plan is something that is optional. If you notice, so you need to provide a table to put in your conceptual preliminary design stage. What are you going to use it for? You see, for investment calculation, for energy simulation, and so on. So these are basically optional requirements. But a lot of engineers and architects are actually doing that because the model is already there. So you have to repurpose the model. So instead of me creating another mathematical model, then might as well for me to reuse the geometry that is already found in the BIM models. Okay? That is the reason why we have an analysis plan. Yeah. Okay. And then if you go down to the project stages, the detailed design, construction, and as-built, you would have another form of this is quite a table for your analysis plan. What are you going to use it for? Yeah. So that is a typical one. Collaboration plan. This is a table for you to key in how exactly are you going to do your model federation. Okay. So at the design coordination stage, what are you going to do with it? What is the frequency and who will be the participants? And where are you going to do it? You know, are you going to do it on an actual face-to-face meeting, or you are going to do it via web, you know, via Zoom or via Teams or whatever it is, Google Meet, and so on and so forth. So this is basically your collaboration plan. How often? Is it weekly, fortnightly, or monthly? You know, it depends on the project, on the complexity of the project. Yeah. You have as well your information exchange. I will discuss this later. An example of this, but this basically what the architect produces and how the structural engineer will consume it, or how the mechanical engineer will consume, for example, the structural models. So you have to be very specific on that. And then it comes with quality assurance and quality control. You have four different ones. Yeah. So the first one is a visual check. Most of the BIM managers will do a visual check. You have an interference check between two components if they're clashing, whether they are soft and hard is called an interference check. You have a standards check. Basically, is it following a particular standard? Your dimensions, your line style, your levels, your layers and whatever, and then your model integrity check. So recently in Singapore, as mentioned, we are in the process of migrating to CoreNetX, wherein the validation of models are done by computers. So this will be in the Singapore context is fully automated, but in other parts of Asia, for example, this is still actually are done manually. Yeah. Um, so I mentioned about the must have and optional for BIM execution plan. So I would like to give to you best practices from the projects that we have done for quite some time, for the last 10 years. Is I mentioned about identifying BIM goals and uses. This should be attended by your senior management and BIM management staff, okay, including the owner, the designer, the contractors, and the key subcontractors. You have a design BIM execution plan, okay, um, attended by the owner, the BIM managers, and the project managers of the project. And then you have to develop your information exchanges, and you have to review your final BIM execution plan, and it has to be attended by all parties that is involved. Another best practice is monitoring the progress against a BIM execution plan. So, for example, on a monthly basis, we discuss the progress of the project and address any implementation challenges. I have to note and I have to say to you that a BIM execution plan is not a fixed document. On some of our projects, we actually edit the BIM execution plan on a monthly basis. We resubmit it because we it's a method statement, right? And then the method statement is not workable. We have to tell the client or the architect or the engineer that, oh, we will do it differently the following week, the following month, for example. So it's not a fixed document. You have to continuously modify, as mentioned. If there is an addition of team members, obviously, if you're adding coordinators or modelers, or there is a replacement to the BIM manager, you have to modify your BIM execution plan. Revisions to available technology changes. So the software actually change on a yearly basis, if you notice. And if you have a project that is done on multi-year, let's just say the design is about 2 years, and then the construction is another 4 years. The technology is already moving. There might be a new, like for example, you have before you just have IFC, but now you can actually exchange comments on the BCF, BIM collaboration format. And just last year, around October, there's IDS, Information Delivery Specification from Building Smart. So these are revisions to available technology, and you have to adapt to it if it's available already so that you can use it. Changes to the overall project conditions. If a project, for example, is designed and built and suddenly it becomes a build project, to reflect the actual processes that is involved. Because sometimes you have an execution plan that is quite idealized, and then you notice that it is not actually workable. You are not following the execution plan. You are actually doing another way, or you are using another product. So might as well reflect the actual process that you are using. Yeah. So that's why it's an execution plan, right? If you are deviating from your execution plan, it is just a must that you update the execution plan to what is actually you're doing. Yeah. So sometimes like this, there is an aspirational part of the BIM execution plan, but at the same time, you have to cover yourself with the actual reality on the project. So maybe in terms of cost, in terms of you are reducing the steps from, let's just say, 10 steps, reducing it to 3 steps. It's much easier. Or your required execution plan requires you to deliver an X amount of format or file format, but you are dealing with your model are becoming bigger, so you have to use lightweight, for example, versions of your model. That is that you need. What I'm trying to say here is that you have to document what you're actually doing, instead if you're already deviating from your execution plan. Another one is agree on a formal plan for accepting updates to the plan. So we have versions. Are you updating it? Whatever, if the changes are there, are you updating it on? You are collecting all of the changes, or you updating it on a monthly basis? Up to you. So there are certain projects that the client is allergic to receiving monthly updates. So we actually update it on a quarterly basis so that all of the changes are consolidated and submitted on the quarter at the end of the quarter. Okay. So a lot of this, um, I'm giving you an example here. This is actually from a project that we have done in Singapore for the Singapore Changi Airport. Um, I'm not in the position to give to you the entire document, but the table of contents I already put in here. So in a typical BIM execution plan, you have a framework and overview, just like what I have described to you. There is a project information and scope. You have the project goals and objectives, which I have discussed with you. The important one is number 4, which is your modeling plan. What are you going to do? How are you going to start your models? Your deliverables, specific to the models. What are you going to use the model for? The collaboration strategy between interdisciplines and intradiscipline, and you have your quality control and quality assurance. How are you going to make sure that you have your interference check, your standards check, and so on and so forth? Technology infrastructure, do you have a common data environment? How are you going to save your models? What software are you going to use? And then appendices. So this particular one. So these are the typical components of a BIM execution plan. Okay. So that's basically the end of the BIM execution plan. I will be discussing to you about the employer or the exchange information requirements because this affects the BIM execution plan. So if you notice, with the publication of the BS 1192, with the British Standard 1192, and then the ISO 19650, the BIM execution plan actually changes now. Okay, that's why the topic of this presentation is the evolution, because the EIR is responsible for that change. Okay, so let's discuss exactly what is an EIR. So an EIR is simply an employer's information requirement or an exchange information requirement that is form part of the appointment and tender documents on a BIM project to enable the supplier. The supplier, as I mentioned to you, are the consultants or the contractor to produce their initial BIM execution plan. So there is a lot of updates now on what is an EIR. EIR sometimes can be very, very thick, So I have seen EIR that is about 550 pages long. So the BIM execution plan also changes, right? So as mentioned, the BIM execution plan is just a method statement that is generated in response to the employer information requirements or the exchange information requirements. Okay, so it's a pre-tender document that sets out the information to be delivered, the standards and processes that the supplier should adopt during the project delivery processes. So this is the main reason why the BIM execution plans are actually evolving, because the EIR is also evolving. Okay, so as mentioned, an EIR is an information relating to the delivery of an asset. It needed to answer the project information requirement or the PIM. The EIR, the information specification for an appointment that is made, and some EIR can actually originate from the asset management. So some of the EIR for some projects that is specific, that has a lot of emphasis on facility management, it actually started from the asset managers. Yeah. And then they are actually converted or rewarded to the EIR. That is the information that has to be generated for a particular project. So it has to answer for that. So you might be asking, oh, okay, I understand the EIR is the specification and the BEP is the method statement. What is the relationship, or what is the difference between the two? So I already put it here. The EIR and the BEP are both necessary documents. The EIR serves to identify the needs and information requirements by the client. So the client is the one normally generates the employer information requirement or the EIR. The BIM execution plan serves as the intention, as mentioned, or the method statement to respond to the needs that is expressly put in the EIR. So, and then it covers all of the requirements. So sometimes if you have 100-page EIR, your BIM execution plan will be 3 times or 4 times as as thick, Yeah. So normally that would be the normal case. Yeah. I have not seen a BIM execution plan that is actually lesser than the EIR, because you have to cover for all of the requirements that is mentioned in the EIR. So that's the difference between the two. Okay. So in reality, this is a very nice graph. This is actually from BSI. It basically describes to you which one delivers what. So, for example, the organization information requirements encapsulates the asset information requirements, and then it specifies the asset information model. Okay. And then the project information requirements contributes to the EIR, which is the exchange information requirements, and specifies the project information model. And then you have the two of them, the asset information model and the project information model. If you are submitting a BIM execution plan, you need to describe how are you going to generate or deliver your asset information model and the project information model. By the way, the project information model is design and construction, and the asset information model is actually this refers to operation and maintenance already. So these are two specific deliverables that covers different areas or stages of your project. Okay, so to put it in another perspective, you have an ARR, the organization, the asset is all encompassing, okay, and the EIR is the general one. So if you have an EIR, this covers the asset information model. So they are the all encompassing employer or exchange information requirements. Okay, the asset information requirements are specifically, like I mentioned here, information relating to the operation of an asset. So as mentioned, an EIR can actually originate on how the particular asset needs to be operated and what kind of information that needs to be put in there. It needed to answer organizational information requirements such as, um, what information do you need, for example, for a pump? Do you need the power rating? You need the flow rate? You need the spare parts, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so that is covered by the asset information requirement. So because of these changes, the BIM execution plan also changes. Yeah, because they need to answer for all of these requirements. Yeah. So to put it into picture, these are the dependencies. So if you have an asset information requirement that actually cascade down to the project information requirement, then your employer or exchange information requirements are actually populated back. So this is basically the dependencies. It's like a cascade of information coming from the facility manager all the way to the people on site, like the contractors or the consultants, and all the way to the consultants and contractors. Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about samples. Okay, so these are EIR samples. So this is from a project that I have done for the deep tunnel sewerage system. I cannot share to you the actual document, but what I can give to you is the table of contents. So in the table of contents, normally you will have definitions. These are common. So before the start of the document, you are defining what is an EIR, what is a BEP, and so on and so forth. You have general principles. You have the actual BIM execution plan. We discussed about the objectives, the responsibilities, and the deliverables. And what is quite important is your risk allocation. The intellectual property rights, is it owned by the architect or the engineer, or is it owned by the client? You have your model and level of details, or LOD. You have your modeling requirements, project document management, how you're going to produce the drawings, the PDF, for example, and so on and so forth. You have data exchange file formats. If a particular architect would like to send the model to an engineer, what are the data exchange formats that you're going to use? The software applications, the process and procedure, your roles and responsibilities, and your key quality control and design review coordination. So this is the typical scope of an EIR. Okay. And then that's why the BIM execution plan is now evolving, because the scope of the employer information requirement is actually quite heavy now. If you see the list here, you need to reply to this. So a BIM execution plan has to be able to respond to these requirements, this 14 requirements here. Okay. On another project that we were working on, the Thames Tideway, when I was actually in Jacobs, this is a typical EIR, or employer BIM specifications. So you have an introduction or the definition or the overview. You have the information standards, BIM execution plan, it's about 50 pages. And then you have information exchange, information resources. How are you going to have that? Asset data standards. So I mentioned to you about the facility management, right? So even in the EIR, we are already discussing what is the asset data standards. So you have the data dictionary is already here actually. And so from the beginning of the project, it is quite clear what we are going to deliver at the facility management stage. So as mentioned to you before, this should not be an afterthought. You have to be quite, when you write an EIR or you are writing a method statement, a BIM execution plan to respond to an asset data standards, you have to be quite clear. What are my data drops? If I am producing a facility model or an asset information model, who will be filling up all of those attributes or properties? It cannot be just the consultant, right? Or the contractor or the or the client or the developer. It has to be all of the people. So you have to put in your data drops. Project information model, as mentioned to you, this is design and construction. So that is basically quite easy to understand. You have your CAD standards because you still have people use still CAD standards. Okay, please do not confuse them with GIS or geographic information systems. The CAD standards refer to your MicroStation or your AutoCAD, and your GIS it refers to your like Bentley Maps or Civil 3D or InfraWorks. It's quite different. Okay, you have your EIR compliance checking. This can be manually done, or automated, or assisted. That's another topic on its own. You have your codes, identifier codes, your common data environment, your CAD standard, and your BIM standard. So in the UK, the BIM execution plan is actually needed to respond to all of these requirements. Yeah. So in this particular project, our BIM execution plan, if I remember it correctly, is about 160 pages long. So because we need to respond to all of these requirements. Yeah. Okay. So in the project that I am actually doing, this is my second to the current project that I'm doing. There's the EIR is actually just three components. So you have your information management, you have your project information model, and you have your asset information model. I will not read it to you, but basically there are only three distinct requirements: the information management, the project information model, and then the asset information model. And if you notice from there, you would see actually the discipline groups. What are you going to do with, let's just say, asset data dictionary or asset tagging? So it is not an afterthought. It has to be there from the very beginning. And your BIM execution plan must be able to respond to all of these requirements. You see. So what I'm trying to say here, I hope you get the gist already, or the summary of what I'm trying to say, is that the BIM execution plan, yes, it is evolving, especially if you are doing VDC projects or IDD projects. But the main reason that the BIM execution plan is evolving, if you notice, is that the EIR or the employer information requirement is also evolving. And then it depends on a particular project or a particular location, whether it is in Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, you have Vietnam, and so on and so forth. They have specific country requirements, and your BIM execution plan is just basically responding to all of those requirements. Okay. This is a sample of a project that I have done when I was in ACOM, the Kuala Lumpur Singapore High Speed Rail. And these are the project standards. This is a typical EIR for that particular project in 2018. It's just quite unfortunate that Malaysia canceled this project, but that is actually this was quite memorable because we were actually, we developed a very detailed BIM execution plan for this particular project. Yeah. So this is the last part, basically, discussing to you the different, how to say this, the differences of BIM execution plan, for example, in the UK. Yeah, in the UK, if you notice, you would see the word PAS, that is the publicly available specification. These are the standards, draft standards that becomes the British standard, and so on. So you can see that there would be two of them. You would notice the PAS, as mentioned, are draft, and then the actual standards are British standards. And if you're actually looking at the project, international BIM standards, it would be already ISO. So that is the main difference. Okay. So in the UK, how are you going to respond if it says create an asset information requirement based on these two standards? So I've given to you a typical example of that. If you actually look at these two standards, the 55-2 and then the 8587, you have to answer the legal information, the commercial information, you have to answer the financial information and the technical information of a particular project. So it's a full-time job. This is not something that you can just read those two standards and then respond to it. You have to really digest it. You have to really know what you're doing and then put it as a method statement in your BIM execution plan. Okay. The last one will be managerial information. So this is I already put in for you. So these are the things that you need to know to be able to create a BIM execution plan that addresses this particular requirement. Okay. Another one is, this quite common now. Develop a model production and delivery table, MPDT. An MPDT is just a master table of all of the TIDP, the task information delivery plan. So if you have a task information delivery plan, you can actually create your MPDT very easily. So all of this is actually coming from the BS 1192, and then now actually it is now part of the ISO 19650 standard. So you need to go and train yourselves on what is ISO 19650. So it would say there, compliance to the EIR and so on and so forth. So these are actually from the BIM task group. Actually, they renamed now the BIM task group in the UK now. I forgot the name. This is NEMA, I think. The BIM task group from the UK is actually called NEMA, NIMA. Yeah, now. So it's a completely different standard. It's evolving still. Okay, so I mentioned about the TIDP. The task information delivery plan is the individual delivery plan per discipline, and then you are going to the compilation of all of your TIDP is actually the model production and delivery table. So this is the master table, and the individual TIDP is actually here. So every single discipline will produce, whether it is a discipline or a subconsultant or subcontractor, will produce this per deliverable, and then they are actually summarized into a model production and delivery table. Okay, so and then how are you going to respond to, like, for example, supplier capability statements? So these are if you notice, these are the plain language questions that I mentioned to you at the start of the presentation, and then how are you going to answer that? So you have to also answer that using your BIM execution plan. And then I mentioned about the PLQ, the plain language question. There is now a trend wherein the specifications or the employer requirements are now written in simple language to avoid the misinterpretation of your requirements. It has to be written in simple English that can be understood by the modeler, by the coordinator, by the BIM manager, and so on and so forth. Okay. COBie is a completely different topic now. So a lot of BIM execution plan needs to handle COBie. COBie for me is actually very simple. I'll just give you an analogy. COBie is like a recipe for a chocolate cake. It will not be a chocolate cake if it doesn't involve chocolate, right? So that is the one thing that I would like to emphasize. COBie is a standard. If you actually pick and choose the components of COBie, it's no longer COBie, right? So I hope you understand what I'm trying to say there. That COBie is a standard. Okay, so you either adopt it as a whole. You cannot pick and choose, because if you pick and choose, that is already your standard. You can put a name to it, like a Malaysian standard or whatever it is, Singapore standard or a Thailand standard, but it's no longer COBie. COBie is a complete standard. Okay. I mentioned about the MIDP. This is a typical picture of an MIDP that is now part of BIM execution plans now. This particular MIDP is actually coming from the Scottish Future Trust, which is the Scottish BIM requirements in the UK. There will be requirements like it should be aligned to UK BIM level 1. So this is actually BIM level 1. What is the BIM level 1 checklist, and so on and so forth. So the BIM execution plan now actually respond to this. It is primarily dependent on which particular consultant are following, for example, the UK standards or the Singapore standards, and so on and so forth. So you have a specific checklist that you need to conform to. That's the reason why BIM execution plan now are quite long. And this is actually the last one. The BIM manager must ensure the checkprint for all drawings should be generated from BIM. These are funny standards, that I encounter in one of my projects. Okay, so that you have checkprints for all of your drawings that is actually generated from BIM. How are you going to do that? And how are you going to prove that you're actually doing that? You have like this. This is a typical checklist for a BIM execution plan in Asia. This is actually true if it's in Hong Kong, in Malaysia as well, and in Singapore. So this is a typical execution plan template. And it's now changing. In Hong Kong, in particular, they have their own standards. So for people who are listening in Hong Kong, the Construction Industry Council has their own execution plan, and then they have a particular standard or a template that for you to fill up or to use, for a specific project in Hong Kong. So, for example, this is how you're going to respond to this. The contractor shall follow the timeline for this particular BIM execution plan. So what I'm trying to say here is that there's no such thing as a final version of the BEP. There's actually a lot of revisions. Okay. So if you have new lessons learned, you have developed a new process, and you're adopting a new technology, the BIM execution plan is actually a live document. You have to update it. Okay. The information exchange workflows. So these are actually changing now. Okay. So this is a typical one for one of my projects. The entire technology stack is actually described here. Okay. So now you have engineering workflows for infrastructure projects. What is actually how the models are going to be federated and so on and so forth, how they're going to be checked for quality assurance and quality control. Are you using structural analysis, for example, in your models? Yeah, that can be done as well. So this is what we call information exchange protocols. Yeah. And then I think this is the last one, I think. The funny thing that there is this requirement. This is just a screen capture of one of the requirements. It says progress payment is using quantities extracted from BIM. Actually, in one of my projects, this is actually quite clear. The quantities are actually the quantities that is paid to the contractor is actually dependent on the model. So if you don't model it, you will not going to get paid. So that is the funny one. So so you have hyper accurate models because you are responding. The progress payment is actually quite dependent on the quantities that is generated from the models. So that is an exciting new evolution because you are forced to model it. Otherwise, you will not get paid. So that is something that is quite new. And then this is actually a real project that I have done quite some time. So to put it into summary, I'm sorry, I'm already out of time. It's been an hour already. So BIM execution plans shall be written in plain language. I keep on repeating that, plain language questions that can be understood by modelers, coordinators, managers, and most especially the client. A BIM execution plan is simply a method statement that responds to a specification, okay? What we call as an EIR or an exchange or an employer information requirement. It has to be constantly updated as new project team members join. You have site restriction as discovered. You have new BIM regulations because this is dependent on the country. If they have introduced a new BIM regulation, you have to respond to that or you have to cover it. And if the client requirements change actually. So for projects that are quite big, multi-year, the client requirements actually changes. So as the client require another deliverable, you have to update your execution plan as well. And then I keep on mentioning that the facility management must not be an afterthought and shall be considered as early as detailed design and taken seriously during construction. Because, as mentioned, you must not deliver your asset information model at the end of the project. It must be gradually being filled up, so that I hope you understand that and then taking that into consideration. The BEP shall consider technology updates or upgrades related to the new standards or file formats. So for example, we have now IFC4, we have BCF, and we have IDS that is launched last year. And obviously the software, right? They are changing every year. You have a new version of ACC, a new version of iTwin, almost every year or every other year. The BIM execution plan must be able to respond to specific requirements that I mentioned at the end of my presentation. Is for example, quantities from the models. These are new project requirements. You are not going to be paid if you cannot extract the quantities from the model. That is something new. You have new exchange protocol. I give you an example for an engineering project that I have done, a real project. And lastly, about model checking, because this has been an up and coming one, model checking from the regulatory perspective. Okay, and for that, I hope that you learned something. We can have our Q&A. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Sonny, for that insightful and captivating presentation. We'd now like to invite our attendees to share any thoughts, insights, or queries with Sonny for our Q&A session. So just use the chat box on the right-hand side to type out your questions. So we have a first question already from Mr. Muhammad Afiq Fahmi. He asks, how can BEP or BIM help in simulating and analyzing water flow and flood risks in the design phase?
Sorry,
and
my
what are the
microphone is
main
muted.
differences in?
Sorry. Go ahead. Is that the
No
question
problem.
already, or
Go
is it
ahead,
a
Sonny.
follow-up question? Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, there is a follow-up question. So what are the main differences in preparing a BEP for infrastructure projects like flood defenses versus traditional building projects?
Okay, so let me just go back to the slides that I have, because I think I describe it there. You can still see my slides, right? Give me a moment. Sorry, this one. Can you see this? To answer your question, these are architecture and structure are typical building projects. So the objects, the families, the cells, whatever you want to call it, the elements are mostly here, described here, architectural and structural and mechanical, right? Mechanical elements. If you talk about infrastructure projects, he mentioned about flood control, right? This talks about civil beam elements. You notice from here? So you have rainwater and stormwater pipeworks. You would not normally need that for a typical building project. But if it is an infrastructure project, then you would need something like that, like outlets, surface channel, manholes, and so on and so forth. You need to have a geology report or a utilities model, and you need to have a digital terrain model. Okay, so this is not something that building projects would normally need. They would need it, but as a very small component only. But if you have infrastructure project, and the question is actually asking about, I actually have now currently a dam project that I am actually doing, two dam project in the Philippines. And these are the components that we have in our model. Yeah. Quite very different if I'm just doing building projects. Yeah. So
Okay, great. Thank you
actually
for that, Sonny.
actually in Singapore there is actually
We haven't.
a big, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, a BIM infrastructure plan actually. Yeah, so in place. Okay, I hope I answered the question. Yeah. Yeah,
Okay, we
go
have
ahead.
another one from Shafani Jack. How should a BIM manager approach the challenge of aligning BEP requirements with varying international standards and regulations, especially when managing projects with multinational teams and diverse regulatory landscapes?
Okay, as mentioned to you before, right? So before you even start to create your BIM execution plan, you have to be mindful of the employer requirements. And then sometimes, if you have, let's just say I'm a developer, right? I'm creating, let's just say, a condominium project. We have 10 towers. That is a big project, right? And I hire an American architect, and then I hire basically a UK based engineer. Those are two conflicting already. So, and then you have a Malaysian standards, right? So, so the architect will write their requirements. that is based in the US standards, and then your engineer will be writing something that is based on the UK standards, the one that I showed you before in the presentation, and then you have local regulations in Malaysia. So you must read all of these requirements, combine them, okay, and then make it, how to say this, deconflict them, meaning to say that if the architect is requiring this one, when I say deconflict, meaning to say that when you write your employee information requirement, it has to be consistent. It cannot be that the architect is saying one thing and then the engineer requirement is another story. It's a complete conflict of one another. So you have to deconflict it. You have to sit down with your architect and then the engineer and say, can you please, can we have a common, let's just say, file format, or we put the common data environment on this particular platform instead of you requiring this and you requiring that, and then the local regulation says otherwise. You see, you have to deconflict them because there are three different requirements. So that is how do I do that? By sitting down, talking to them, what is really important, what is not important. Is it a must-have or is it an optional thing? If it's a must-have, then I need to get consensus from my architects, from my engineers, so that when I write the employer information requirement, they are actually in one tone. That's my point. So I hope I've explained my part. But that if I'm the one at his position, I would do what I just described to you, to 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 have a consistent and then a consistent employer requirement. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. City Anis asks, is it important to put FMIS requirements in the BEP based on your experience, if we want to include the process during the detailed design phase?
Yes, it is. It is actually quite important. So, as mentioned about the facility management, right, information requirements or specifications, it must not be an afterthought. Okay, I keep on repeating that because I have seen a lot of projects wherein the facility management requirements is an afterthought. We have already created our models in design and construction, and then the client wants us to deliver it differently. So it must not be an afterthought. You must have those requirements at the very early stage of your design stage. Yeah, so that it is anticipated, the attributes and the parameters are already there, and it's just a simple matter of data drop. When are we going to fill up those requirements, and who will be responsible for entering those attributes or populating? Sorry, um, who will be responsible in populating those properties or those attributes? Yeah. So that is the key thing. You must learn how to have your data drops. That is a Kobe actually. It's a Kobe terminology. Data drops. So if you have 100 items, you must learn how to prioritize. Like for example, the first 30 are for the consultants. The second 40 is for the contractor, and the rest is who will fill up. Is it the material supplier? Is it the one who commissioned it, the project, a particular equipment, for example? Because all of this data needs to be populated by different persons. And that is the idea of data drops. Who is going to populate them at what stage and at what time? Yeah. And who are going to validate all of those, right? It's easy to key in something, right? What is the power rating? But the contractor buy another another supplier from another supplier. It's a different power rating. It's slightly different, right? So who is going to validate those? Is it the contractor, um, or is it the one who actually commissioned it, that particular, or turn on that particular equipment? So that is a tricky thing. I hope I answered the question.
Okay, thanks for that. We have one more here from Zin Sulaiman. What advanced methodologies can be employed to measure and enhance the performance and productivity of BIM processes in a BEP, especially in complex or large-scale projects?
Um, how to say this? So, for me, right, how do we going to improve? It is a constant challenge, you see, to improve a BIM execution plan. So in all of the projects that I have been through, there is the BIM execution plan is a live document. You must constantly update it. You know, you must not write it for the sake of submission and then put it in a drawer and forget about it. No, no, no. So for us, it is our daily document. We open it. That's the first thing that I open in the morning. And it is the last thing that I close in my computer at the end of the day. And then if you have suggestions, for example, or you have an execution plan, but you are deviating from your execution plan, you must record what exactly do you do, and then document that, update it in the BIM execution plan. There is actually no harm, you know. So if you mention, for example, in your execution plan, I'm going to do these 10 things, but in reality, you found a procedure or a workflow that can only be done it in 6 steps, right? From 10, you reduce it to 6 steps. Might as well document those 6 steps, right? Instead of 10, you know, because those 10 steps will normally, like for example, it will take you 4 hours. If I can do it in 2.5 hours in under 6 steps, might as well, you know, update it, you know. A BIM execution plan is a live document. So you have to constantly update it. Yeah. There's even a point in time wherein I mentioned to you, right? The BIM execution plan that we do, we update it on a monthly basis. Sometimes we update it on a quarterly basis, but it is constantly being updated. Yeah. My BIM execution plan, when I open it, it's not in PDF. It is always in Word. So every day something I have to edit it. You know, if you open your BIM execution plan and you're reading it from a PDF, there's something wrong already. Yeah, because you are just reading it. You know, as a BIM manager or a VDC manager or digital delivery manager, you must be able to document what you're doing and put that onto paper. Yeah. So that is my answer to that question.
Okay, thanks again. Shazwan asks, when the design stage is completed and suddenly the consultant wants to change the design, what are they supposed to do as a contractor? So as you mentioned now, the BIM execution plan is a live document. How do you update it to manage VOs?
Okay. There's a few questions there. So you're talking about a consultant, right? And then how are they going to do with the contractor? I mentioned to you about the concept of VDC, right? Virtual design and virtual construction. Obviously, there is a BIM manager for the design stage. It can be the architect or the engineer, right? And then if you are a contractor, the BIM manager can also be an architect or an engineer, correct? Or it can even be an IT professional. There's actually such a case. The idea of VDC is that there's a handshake between the design and then the contractor. Yeah. So when I say handshake, meaning to say that the design model has to be used from the contractor perspective, because we're talking about geometry. You know, geometry you can reuse, right? So what is the sense of recreating the geometry if you already have it? You know, even if you say, you know, oh, I'm using Revit, but the contractor is using Bentley or Tekla, for example, or ArchiCAD for that matter, the geometry is still there. You can still reuse the geometry. The biggest component is that the deliverable of the consultant ends at the design stage actually. So when it's actually approved by the authority having jurisdiction, let's just say a city engineer or a city architect, the responsibility ends there. You know, so it can be as little as, you know, as an IFC file, or it can be a Revit file, or whatever it is, or it can be a drawing, for example. But if you're a contractor, the deliverable is actually very different because you need to produce shop drawings, right? You need to produce quantities. You know, you have to order. You know, you have to order how many rebar do I need? You know, how many doors do I need? Right? How many windows do I need? If I have, you know, how many meters of cables do I need, for example, or how many pieces of FCU do I need, right? So these are the concerns of a contractor, right? So they are more hyper accurate, I can say. You know, when I what do I mean by that? They are more accurate, as I mentioned, right? In one of the slides that I shown you, there is a requirement wherein the client will not pay for your model if you cannot quantify it from the model. So it it forces the contractor to model everything. Yeah. So because he cannot claim, that is actually a very, very clever client, because it forces the contractor to create an as-built model that is also hyper accurate, right? So that is the relationship between a design model and a contractor model. And then I also keep on mentioning about the facility management, right? Because that is a completely different model. Even in the ISO standards, the project information model, which is design and construction, is very different from the asset information model. So there are only two models in ISO 19650: project and then asset, So an asset model is actually a very big deliverable. There are certain projects wherein we have a lot of difficulty creating an asset information model. Project information model is very easy. I think from the audience, everybody knows what is a project information model. It's quite easy to actually deliver. But an asset information model is actually a very different one. So I hope it's not an afterthought, yeah, because it takes a lot of time to deliver an AIM. Yeah. I hope I answered the question.
Okay, our next question comes from Nofatiha. From your opinion, is it possible or good practice for a BEP to be integrated into the project quality plan, PQP, or should it remain a separate document? Well, what do you think, Sonny?
It can be included. It can also be a separate. But if you ask me, it is better to have it as a separate document. I'm aware of a project quality plan (PQP). We have done it in our previous project. Normally they are integrated. Normally, right? But if you ask me, it is better to separate it. Yeah. I think the better question is, your employer information requirement is completely separate, yeah, from your project quality plan, yeah, or PQP. Yeah. That is just my opinion. I may be wrong, but that is just my personal opinion on the question.
Okay, I think we trust your expert judgment on this one. So to answer that question, yes, normally should integrate into the PQP.
Yeah,
So
normally,
as we're
yes,
approaching the
they're
end of our
integrated.
Q&A session, yeah. So as we approach the end of our Q&A session, I'd just like to remind everyone that if we couldn't get to your question during this webinar, or if you have further questions, our speakers will be happy to address them offline. Just send us an email or get in touch with PCSS and we'll get back to you. So our final question comes from Kyrul Gerardo. What are the specific protocols for data exchange and collaboration among project stakeholders using BIM software? And what are the security measures in place to protect BIM data and ensure its integrity?
This is a very interesting question. So first thing first, the data exchange, right? I mean, okay, the best practice is, if you use one software, it is better to stick with that same vendor. That's the easiest answer to that question. Meaning to say that if I use Revit, then I will use Civil 3D. I will also use AutoCAD. I will also use InfraWorks. They all belong to Autodesk, right? And if I have Bentley, if I have Open Building, might as well use, Open Roads, Open Rail, right? Generative Components, GC. These are all Bentley, right? Or iTwin. These are all Bentley products, right? Because it's much easier to have it on the same ecosystem or the same vendor. The struggle on the data exchange protocol becomes a problem if the architect is using ArchiCAD, the engineer is using Revit, and the contractor is using Tekla. That's a big problem. So if that happens, then the only way for you to federate the model is use IFC, right? Yeah. So now we have a big problem with IFC4, meaning to say that it's not yet fully adopted, right? 2x3, IFC 2x3 is still the widely available exchange file format, right? I hope that it can change in the future, but um, that is become a problem, as I said, if if you're dealing with different modeling authors. In our project before, we decided not to use IFC. We actually use iModel, right? Even because primarily we are using Bentley products. We do have Revit models, but we export them to iModel as well, and then federate it that way. So this is the data exchange protocol that we have done for that particular project. So there's also a project wherein, as mentioned here, so IFC, it can be iModel, it can be another file format if you wanted to actually. Yeah, so it depends, depending on the capability of the BIM manager or the capability of the one that is managing all of the discipline. Yeah, so that is actually, as I said, depending on the capability, and then what is the proposed federation strategy or federation model or file format that you're going to use. That's the answer to the first question, right? That's my answer to the second question. Is talking about, you mentioned, what's the second question? What is the
What are the security measures in place to protect BIM data and ensure its integrity?
okay. This is easily answered. Having a CDE basically answers this question. A common data environment. It only becomes a problem. It only becomes a security issue where the architect is saving it into one. Let's just say the architect is saving it into, let's just say, Econex, and then another one is saving it in ACC, right? And then another one is saving it in ProjectWise. Yeah, it only becomes a problem because they're exchanging from different CDE. That's why it's called a CDE, right? It must not be multiple data environment. It has to be common, right? That's why it's called C, common. So the client must nominate a common, common data repository wherein everyone will actually save it, because it is much easier to control or secure a single data repository or data exchange rather than multiple. So it becomes, it's easier. Let's just say if you have encryption or access rights, this will solve your security issue. So for example, before you upload, you have to digitally sign it. So that makes sure that this is actually coming from the actual architect, because it can be intercepted halfway and then you upload the new one, and then there's also a proper version control. Let's just say last week it's version 12 and suddenly it becomes version 32. There's something wrong, right? I'm meaning to say that how did it become version 32? So there's a jump from version 11 to version 32. So are you recording it every single time that you upload? Is it version 11, then it becomes version 12? You have a tracking history of, who uploaded this. Is it signed by who? This is the latest version, because a lot of problems in BIM, in model federation, is tracking who actually contributed who, what, and then is it coming from the correct source? Is it, we're all in version 12, might, for example, the architect is in version 12 and the engineer is obviously two versions or three versions behind, right? So how do you track all of this? That can be easily solved if you have a common data environment or a CDE, because most of the CDE now are common. If all of the disciplines is saving or working on a common repository, then that solves all of your security issues. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have for today. In wrapping up our exploration on the evolution of BIM and BEPs today, we'd like to extend a special thank you to Mr. Sonny Angelis for sharing his valuable insights and his years of industry experience. So it's my pleasure to present a certificate of appreciation to Mr. Sonny now for his contribution as today's guest speaker. So round of virtual applause for Sony.
Thank you.
And before we conclude our session for today, it's tradition around here to take a group photo at the end of every webinar. So while we can't physically gather, we can still create a memorable snapshots together. So kindly turn on your webcams, no pants necessary, and we will, yeah, take a group photo. Okay, let's get a few more people. Don't be shy, guys. Okay, we're taking our snapshot in 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you all so much for your attendance and your attention. Before we depart, we'd like to share a little bit on our services and products. If any of you are interested for a BIM demo on any of our services, or you're interested to participate in our trainings, just kindly contact us through our email or over the phone. For those interested in BIM training, we're actually organizing a full BIM training in October, so please contact us for more information on that. And for those who have BIM projects and need any assistance, we're here to provide solutions and support. We're also the local distributors and software partners with Bentley and Autodesk software. Um, and yeah, momentarily we'll be sharing the attendance QR code so that we can accurately track your attendance and provide you with your e-certificate. So kindly request you to scan and fill in the attendance form, which will be available on the screen any moment now. And lastly, a big thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us. Your participation and engagement have made this webinar a complete success. And we hope you leave today with a deeper understanding on BIM execution plans. Once again, thank you all for being a part of this enlightening session, and stay tuned for the QR code. We look forward to seeing you again in our future webinars. On behalf of PCSS, stay safe and see you soon. Thank you all so much.